Infertility isn't a disease to be bypassed, it's a symptom to be healed. In this episode, Heritage Foundation policy analyst Emma Waters joins me to discuss IVF, its hidden costs, risks, ethical challenges, and how it's reshaping the way we think about the family, technology, and human life. We'll unpack the growing IVF industry, the rise of embryo selection, eugenics in IVF, what happens to the leftover embryos, and why restorative reproductive medicine is the healthier, ethical, more human centered way forward. Stay tuned. This conversation will change the way you think about making human life in a lab. Welcome to the Bioethics Babe podcast, where we examine the tough questions in human flourishing in light of science, faith, and culture. I'm your host, Arina Grossu Agnew. Now let's dive in. Emma Waters is a policy analyst at the Heritage Foundation Center for Technology and the Human Person, where she focuses on the intersection of family, biotechnology, and reproductive medicine. She is a co-author of a statement at First Things titled A Future for the Family, A New Technology Agenda for the Right. Her first book, Lead Like Jail, will be released with Skyhorse Publishing in 2026. Emma graduated valedictorian at Lee University with a BS in Political Science and a BA in Biblical and Theological Studies. She is currently pursuing a Master of Public Policy at the Catholic University of America. She lives in Pennsylvania with her husband and 2 daughters. Thoughtful, articulate, and passionate about the future of the family and human dignity in a technological age, please welcome Emma Waters.
Hi. Hey, thanks so much for having me on today.
Of course, Emma. Thank you so much for being with us. You play a huge role, especially in this area, among other areas, but you're at the forefront on these issues. So we wanted to have you on the show to explain to our listeners a little bit more about IVF today. Your work focuses on family biotechnology and reproductive medicine. What first drew you to work on these issues?
Yeah, so when I was an undergrad, I was studying marriage and family structure studies, working with the Institute for Family Studies and a number of other think tanks, and was really interested in the ways that data and science helped us understand what was good for the family and how policy could help us encourage those outcomes. As I was looking through those studies, the COVID pandemic happened, transgenderism was on the rise. I started working for a tech policy podcast, and I started connecting the dots between all of the conversations we were having in marriage and family structure studies, the pro-life space, as well as the developing transhumanism tech space. And I became really interested with the intersection of technology and human conception and development, and the ways that these technologies were really reshaping the way we thought about the family, reshaping the way we thought about children. And so that's where my interest really blossomed in this space. And I've been a policy nerd for a number of years. And so when there was the opportunity to join Heritage back in 2022, I was delighted to start building out the national conservative policy agenda for all of these biotechnologies.
That's incredible and very much needed, because the biotechnologies, every single day there's new things coming out, and we really need a strong voice to be able to speak into those issues as they're happening. So thank you for your work on that. You've written about moving beyond IVF toward fertility care that treats the whole person. Can you explain what you mean by that?
So when people think of infertility, oftentimes they think infertility is a disease and therefore IVF is the solution. And so this very one-for-one approach to infertility, while very understandable, I think, for how most people have interacted with the topic, fails to actually understand the complexity of infertility and the benefits of innovative care that are available today. So when we're talking about infertility, we're actually talking about a symptom of these underlying conditions. It's not just a standalone disease. So you don't get infertility, for example, in the same way that you would get a tumor in cancer or appendicitis when you need it removed. Instead, infertility occurs when there are a number of factors in both the man or the woman's body that are not working as they should. So for women, this could be things like endometriosis, PCOS, thyroid imbalances, hormonal imbalances. For men, things like male factor infertility, diet and lifestyle, and so on. And so when we talk about moving beyond IVF, what we're saying is that we actually want to address those root cause conditions that are at play and resulting in the diagnosis of infertility. And so with IVF can result in the creation of human embryos in a lab by taking egg and sperm. However, it doesn't actually address the underlying causes of infertility and the medical conditions that are going on in the man and woman's body. So you may succeed in creating embryos, but you've actually done nothing to improve the overall health of the man and woman, the hopeful parents who were involved. So when we talk about moving beyond IVF, what we want is to see comprehensive and holistic fertility care offered to men and women that addresses those root causes of infertility and ideally optimizes them so that they can naturally conceive and have the children that they desire, instead of having to just rely on IVF, which can have pretty unreliable and low success rates depending on the situation.
Right. And really, when we talk about IVF, it's the equivalent of putting a band-aid on something without actually getting to the root cause, as you mentioned. And it's not actually fixing the cause of infertility. It's trying to resolve an issue, but by creating other issues. And that's why we're taking on this topic of IVF today, because there are a lot of considerations. And of course, IVF right now is being talked about a lot, especially with everything going on with the Trump administration, and in general, people turn to IVF because they want a family, and they don't understand that there are other ways that they could actually conceive with other technologies that are not problematic ethically. In your article, you argue that the conversation around infertility has been dominated by one equation: IVF equals infertility care. Can you talk a little bit about the main implications of using that framing for couples and for the healthcare system?
Yeah, absolutely. So this comes down or goes back really to what I was saying a second ago, which is that when you think about infertility as the single monolithic disease that simply appears and we can't really understand what's going on behind it, then it's natural to think that you need this one size fits all procedure, which is IVF, to address it. And so that has really motivated a number of fertility organizations, medical societies, and even some state laws to implement IVF mandated coverage. I think about 13 states have some form of mandated coverage for IVF, or to really push advocacy groups to make that the primary goal that they have in mind. There, to treat infertility, we just need more IVF access, more money going toward IVF. And this also tends to intersect with some of the LGBTQ agenda as well, where you have groups like Men Having Babies. Yes, you heard that right. It's an organization called Men Having Babies, who say that it is a form of fertility discrimination for them to not have access to IVF and surrogacy, and usually state covered IVF and potentially surrogacy, depending on the situation. Because why can't two men have a baby if a heterosexual couple ideally could have a baby? And so this is intersected with a number of state level efforts to actually redefine infertility. So not only would infertility be just considered a disease, but a couple of states have even redefined infertility to include your relationship status, meaning that if you're a single woman or a same sex couple, you could be deemed medically infertile under the state definition, even if your own biology and health are perfectly fine. It's just your relationship status is, in effect, infertile because it won't allow you to conceive a child. So, as we're talking about this sort of like one for one definition, there's a number of different ways culturally and policy wise that this starts to bleed out and really subvert a proper understanding of the human body, a proper understanding of the purpose of marriage, sex, and procreation, and the best ways to treat infertility in a way that actually honors and restores the human body rather than just outsourcing fertility to a laboratory.
That's crazy that where we are now is that health insurance companies can cover this under fertility when it's not even a biological issue. When you have healthy individuals but who aren't able to conceive because they're a same-sex couple, et cetera, that are taking advantage of the insurance system. So there's a lot there, and we'll be discussing this a bit more. I want to lay the groundwork for what IVF is all about. So, for people who aren't really familiar with this world of IVF and biotechnologies, it's often presented as the compassionate solution for couples struggling with infertility. But can you talk a little bit about the less discussed downsides or ethical dilemmas that come with IVF?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I want to be very clear here that I'll be talking about IVF as the routine way that fertility clinics typically practice it. There are certainly many instances where Christian couples or other faithful people have chosen to use IVF, but in a way that avoids many of these ethical dilemmas. And so I would say that there's a life sparing approach that couples have taken, but then there's the routine way that the fertility industry typically approaches IVF. And this is the average recommendations they're going to offer. So that's what I'm going to really jump into here, but with the recognition that there are certainly people who have used it who have taken a far more thoughtful approach. But when we're talking about IVF, as I mentioned earlier, you're talking about extracting egg and sperm from a man and woman. Now, that process alone has a number of ethical concerns. So, for example, fertility clinics will oftentimes offer pornography or other video pornography, picture pornography as a way of stimulating masturbation in order to select the sperm. There are technically ways that you can extract the sperm without going that route, but that tends to be the option that clinics sort of de facto rely on. And so, especially as Christians or those who are very concerned about the influence of pornography on our society, there's already this influence within the fertility clinic at the beginning. For women, extracting eggs is an incredibly dangerous and can be a very painful or complicated procedure. So, naturally, a woman will create about one egg per cycle every month. And that's how she has the opportunity to conceive or not conceive, depending on the timing. When it comes to IVF, though, they're looking to grab as many eggs as possible to increase the chances of creating the most embryos to increase their overall success rates. So, women will undergo a pretty strong cocktail of hormonal drugs to stimulate their body to create as many eggs as possible. Now, for some women, that might only be 5 eggs, but there are many cases where women have actually produced as many as 25 or 30 eggs at one time that then have to be extracted from the woman's body. Now, that process can go smoothly, but at other times, there's a number of really dangerous side effects that can come from that can result in breast cancer or ovarian cancer because of the harsh hormonal drugs being used, can result in further infertility for that woman, and in some cases can even turn into life-threatening conditions. So there's a number of things, a number of people who have really pointed out that when we're talking about even just the initial stages of IVF, there's a lack of informed consent that couples receive because we don't actually track the side effects or ongoing outcomes related to egg extraction, for example. And so, in many cases, we don't actually know the potential harms that can and do take place when it comes to just the physical health of the woman. Once those egg and sperm are gathered, they're then taken into a lab and then they're placed in petri dishes where sperm is placed with egg in hopes of conceiving a viable embryo. Now, the moment that egg is fertilized, it is a living, distinct, and genetically complete embryo that, when placed in the proper setting, will continue to grow and develop from the embryonic stage to a blastocyst onwards to a baby in the womb and a live human being. But there's a lot that goes on between that initial conception, implantation, and live birth. So typically, in a routine round of IVF, fertility clinics recommend that parents one, analyze the viability and health of the embryos. So, which embryos look like they're the healthiest, which ones are most likely to result in a pregnancy and live birth. But they'll oftentimes even recommend that couples undergo something called pre-implantation genetic testing, where they're actually testing the embryo for a host of factors like the health outcomes. So, does this embryo look like they'll have Down syndrome or cystic fibrosis or another genetic condition? Looking at the sex of the embryo. There's no gender confusion in fertility clinics across the United States, and it's actually more and more common for couples to actually rely on this technology, even aside from a diagnosis of infertility for family balancing goals. If they have one boy and they want a girl, or if they only want to have girls in their family, so you can select for the sex of your embryo. But then there are even companies like Orchid or Nucleus Genomics that are in addition to the fertility clinics, where they actually rely on something called whole genome sequencing to understand not just basic health outcomes, but over 1,200 conditions that a child may or may not have, as well as this technology could potentially be used to look at things like IQ, personality, and even the looks of the child. So, what if you want to have a child with green eyes or blonde hair, depending on the situation? These technologies are increasingly being used in the fertility clinics and other laboratories to not only help you have a child, but to help you have a certain kind of child. And so it's actually really interesting. Over the summer in July, there was a massive class action lawsuit filed by a woman who had used preimplantation genetic testing at a clinic where the clinic said it's about 98% reliable. So whatever result you get, you can pretty much trust that it's correct. And so because of promises like that, over 40% of IVF cycles in the US use preimplantation genetic testing. Well, after receiving her results, the woman found that some of her embryos would be unhealthy, would have certain genetic conditions, so she had them destroyed, only to find out later that the science around preimplantation genetic testing is actually far more contested. So this class action lawsuit really goes into detail looking at the fact that in over 55% of cases, you're getting a false positive for diseases that your embryo doesn't actually have. In about 33% of cases in another study, they found that when they re-biopsied or restudied the embryos, they actually found that the original diagnosis was incorrect. And in patients that are older, so older women, using these technologies can actually lower your overall success rates because it compromises the health of the embryo. So there are a number of concerns in the space of genetic testing, but I think something that even that I think a number of parents just aren't prepared for and thinking about when undergoing IVF is that once you create the embryo, you only have a couple options before you. You can implant the embryo. You could freeze the embryo for an indefinite period of time. The oldest born embryo that was frozen, I think, was frozen for 27 years and was about the same age as the mother the embryo was born to, which is insane to
Wow.
think about. But there are embryos who are much older who were still in freezing. You can choose to outright destroy the embryo. You can place the embryo up for adoption, and there are some legitimate adoption companies for embryos. It doesn't actually address the fact that there are over about 1 million frozen embryos in the United States. So it could be seen, it is better than outright destroying your embryo, but there's no guarantee that embryo will still have a chance at life. And that's about it. So you can implant, discard, freeze, or place up for adoption. But otherwise, there's just not as many options as I think parents have in mind. And so in some cases, parents will undergo IVF in hopes of having 1 or 2 children and be very successful in that process, but then find out that they still have 2, 3, 4, even 10 embryos left over that they have no idea what to do with. And what's really interesting is that even beyond pro-life discussions, Scott Rasmussen has done polling. The Heritage Foundation has commissioned polling through a third-party organization and found that couples, regardless of their political background, are actually really wary about destroying their human embryos because even if they don't want to attribute legal personhood to the embryo, there is a very real sense where they view that embryo as their child or as their potential child. And so parents find themselves in this position where they're very uncomfortable with the idea of destroying the embryo, but don't really know what to do. Do they continue paying $1,000 every year to maintain the embryo in a frozen cylinder somewhere? Do they place the embryo up for adoption? There's not really good answers to this question. And so those are just a few of the ethical issues that are baked into the process of IVF, where then parents are placed in a position where you then have to start asking questions about, well, what is the parental moral responsibility toward the embryo? If you've created the embryos, then as a parent, then do you have the duty to implant them? Even if you feel like your family is complete, you have a responsibility to the embryos you've created. And I think that's a really hard part of the conversation that a lot of people have tried to reconcile with the process. But again, doesn't really have easy or clean answers because eventually, regardless, you have these embryos that are created, you've maybe tested them for conditions, and now you have to decide what to do with them.
There is so much there to unpack, Emma. From everything you said, I mean, we will unpack each one of those aspects. As you mentioned in the beginning, there's the male implications, and it can implicate masturbation, etc. For the female, another condition is the ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, and again, it can cause so many issues for her. And then on the embryo aspect and the side, we're going to talk a little bit about, as you mentioned, what happens to the embryos, how many are created, how many are frozen or discarded or used for science. So I encountered a gal at a conference. I was speaking on third party reproduction, actually. at a bioethics conference some years ago. And she came up to me after I gave my presentation and she said, "Well, I'm an IVF baby." And she was about 22 or so at the time. And my question to her was, "Oh, how many siblings do you have? And do you know if there were any that are frozen?" And she just looked at me and said, "I've never asked that question." So that week, it was a week-long conference. That week, she called her mom and asked her, "Were there other embryos?" And her mom said, "Yes, there's a few more that have frozen." So imagine the implication for that girl and her siblings who are 22 years old. I think she was a quadruplet because they were all implanted. But then to realize that she had siblings who are frozen embryos, and what kind of impact does that have on family structure? On the fact, will she end up having to pay $1,000 a year or however much it is, and take over at some point, or will they be implanted, or will they be, adopted? So it creates so many issues apart from the actual technological, ethical implications. So it's something that I think we will encounter more and more because there are children created through IVF, and then the fact that there's so many frozen embryos that are also created. That this is something that we have to take head on and really talk about as a society.
An interesting story on this. I similarly had a young woman come up to me at an event that I was speaking at. And she shared that she was also born from IVF, that there were leftover frozen embryos, but her story took it a slightly different route, where around her 25th birthday, her mom actually came to her and told her about the frozen embryos that were left over and then asked if she would be willing to carry them and give them a chance at life. And she had this massive, not quite identity crisis, but a little bit of an identity crisis, realizing that one, she had siblings that she had never met who were still frozen in these storage containers for the last 25 years. But that two, because her mom was now too old to carry them, there was now this added responsibility shifted onto her daughter, where now her daughter felt this burden of, if I don't give these children a chance at life, then what happens to them? Do they just stay frozen? Are they destroyed? And in this young woman's case, she said that she had really wrestled with it, but decided against it. She wasn't married. She was really uncomfortable with the idea of even gestating and birthing her biological siblings. There's so many unknowns in that category. But it just really struck me that along the lines of what Katie Faust has said is that oftentimes, even very unintentionally on the part of the parents, when couples are pursuing these technologies, what they're ultimately doing is they're actually taking the suffering that they're experiencing, their desire for a child, their frustration at their own inability to have a child in the time that they wanted it, and they're placing that suffering onto the child to bear, either with the reality that there are siblings they'll never meet, or siblings that they now feel this burden to either bring into the world or consign to a frozen death. And I think that's one aspect that again, like most parents aren't thinking about when they approach IVF. It's not something that fertility clinics are briefing them on. And yet it's a really, really harsh reality that must be kept in mind when we're talking about these things. And one of the ways that many people have framed it, but I really love to frame it, is that we, of course, delight in every single child that's born, whether it's through IVF or natural conception or any route. But there's a very serious sense, a very real sense, where we're grieving all of the children that we'll never get to meet, all of the siblings that will never be born. And we can get into statistics and success rates, but some of the rough hand estimates that we have show that of all the embryos created in IVF, only about 10 or really like 3 to 10% of all embryos are actually born as live children, which means that 90% of human embryos that are created never actually have the opportunity to take a breath. And so even if your intentions are good, if you have all the pro-life convictions in the world, there's a very real sense that even using this technology with the best of intentions means that the majority of those embryos created are not going to result in a live birth.
And I think that's a really important point, Emma, because IVF is touted as the pro life solution to growing your family. And when people have to understand, if 90% or more of those embryos never actually make it to life, whether because they're frozen or because they die in the process. How is that the pro-life solution, right? We have to do better than that because, as we said in the first show, the ends don't justify the means, and the means in this way are implicate a lot of human life. And I think that that's really the message that we're trying to get across about IVF and when people are thinking about this issue. So you already mentioned some of those statistics, but can you give an average of how many embryos are created usually during an IVF cycle? How many are implanted? And how you already mentioned how many are currently frozen, but do you have the numbers on how many are used for research? How many are discarded? Any of that would be helpful to just really understand the enormity of this issue, how big this issue is becoming, and we're only talking about the U.S. Maybe you have some stats on world information on IVF procedures.
Yeah, these are great questions. And I think some of the most obvious questions that people have is they say, well, we're talking about this big problem of IVF. Well, show me the numbers. What do we know? And this is where I think a lot of people are likewise a little surprised and disappointed. So in the United States, we often like to say that the fertility industry is an underregulated and unaccountable industry, meaning that there are very few federal and state laws actually governing what happens in IVF or providing us insight into the process. So in 1992, the CDC created the only fertility clinic law governing fertility clinic success rates and outcomes. But this is only looking at the number of cycles done, the number of live births, and some basic at birth demographic outcomes. It also goes into egg retrievals and a few other factors, but it's pretty limited in what it actually reports on annually. In addition to that, the last year that this report has actually been published is 2021. So we're now 4 years behind even knowing what's happening in the United States. So we do know that in 2021, there were over 223,000 patients, women, who underwent over 413,000 rounds of IVF. And a round of IVF is just that, or a cycle is just the process of creating the egg and sperm and then creating embryos in a lab. So there were 413,000 cycles that were done. Now, the CDC does not require clinics to actually account for how many embryos are created. So, technically speaking, we don't know how many embryos are created in a given cycle or how many are created in total each year in the United States. And this is a massive area of oversight that, especially among value staffers and pro life conservatives, I think should be a top priority for state or federal tracking requirements. But there are a few studies that are done that show that on average, about 8 to 10 embryos are created in a single cycle of IVF. Now, for some people, they may only have 1, 2, or 3 embryos, and in other cases, they could create as many as 20 embryos in a given cycle. But the average tends to sit around that 8 to 10 number. So if you do just some basic back of the napkin estimates, it means that if an average cycle of IVF results in the creation of 10 embryos, then in 2021, you're looking at the creation of 4.1 million embryos in a given year.
Wow.
And yet, only 97,000 children were born. So it means that based on just that rough estimation, that of all the embryos that were created, only 2.3% actually resulted in the live birth of a child. So these are incredibly low success rates. In addition to that, as I mentioned, there's about 1 million frozen embryos in the United States. These numbers are also fairly outdated. And again, based on some clinic reporting, some estimations, because it's not required for clinics to actually report how many they're storing at a given time. And then in addition to that, when we're talking about IVF tends, like taking all demographics into account, and demographics meaning primarily the age of the woman and her eggs, IVF has about a 25 to 30% success rate. Typically, it takes about 2.5 to 3 cycles of IVF to result in the live birth of a child or decide that such efforts aren't viable for you. So, prior to President Trump's executive order and report on IVF, which will ideally lower the costs of the drugs and the overall process, IVF costs about $15,000 to $30,000 for a single cycle. So, if it requires multiple cycles, you're looking at anywhere from $15,000 to $100,000 just in trying the IVF process, not to mention any of the medical fees, the additional drug prices, or hidden costs, if you will, that go into the process. So we oftentimes like to say that IVF has unreliable success rates and a really high cost. That means that many parents feel like they're trapped between a rock and a hard place where they deeply desire a child. They've been told that IVF is their best or their only option. And yet, even when undergoing IVF, have very unreliable success rates. So one of the stories that really stood out to me in the president's announcement of the IVF report was a young woman who said that she had undergone, I think, 6 rounds of IVF in hopes of having a child. And she ended up having 2 children. But we're talking about countless cycles and treatments and procedures and implantations that she had to undergo. And I think the takeaway for me in hearing that is one, the incredible desire and love that women have for their potential children, the fact that they will do almost anything in pursuit of having a baby, which means that we should be providing them with far more opportunities to actually treat their infertility. But two, in addition to that, that IVF is just not all that it's cracked up to be. It's incredibly, unreliable. And I think there are a lot of false promises where it's set up as sort of this easy one size fits all solution that the numbers and the data that we have just don't back that up. And if you look at the United Kingdom, which has far better reporting requirements and far better laws in place actually governing IVF, you see similar success rates and outcomes. They have a study published, I think, back in 2010, so pretty old at this point, that shows that an average cycle of IVF in their context created about 15 embryos at a time, and yet only 7% of all embryos actually resulted in the live birth of a child. So somewhat, I think, pretty comparable to where the United States is. So it helps give us a bit of a range that we can compare these outcomes to. But the reality is that there's just very little that we actually know about the details of the IVF process, and very little data that we can rely on to really help guide the industry and guide our policy in a way that actually sets couples up for success in their childbearing goals.
Thank you for all that important information. And it blows my mind that the FDA doesn't even require information to the reporting to know how many embryos are created. It reminds me, we did a show recently on chemical abortion and how the FDA isn't interested in getting the reporting for how many women are hurt from chemical abortion. So there's definitely a lot of pressure that we need to put on not only the FDA, but states to make sure that we hold the IVF industry accountable and that we know what's going on, how many embryos are created, what's happening to them, um, how are women hurt in the process, et cetera. There's a lot that we need to know. It's good to know that the UK has more requirements. Maybe that's a good model for the US, at least as a starting point. But we definitely need to know. And as you mentioned with IVF, there's a big cost factor for families, but also it's a big moneymaker for the IVF industry. If families are spending between $15,000 and $30,000 for each cycle, and they require 2 to 3 cycles, that's a lot of money. And isn't it great to know that with restorative reproductive medicine, it's so much cheaper and you get to the root cause of the infertility? So we will talk a little bit about restorative reproductive medicine a little bit later in the show. But I just wanted to go over that. And you mentioned earlier that there are some eugenic practices with embryos, whether it's the screening that's done. One area is obviously when they develop the embryos, they actually look at them. It's called embryo grading. And they look at them and they decide, oh, well, that one looks better than this one. So let's try implanting this one. Could you talk a little bit more about the eugenic practices? You mentioned the sex selection. Obviously, there's sex selective abortions that are happening around the world, but it's also happening with IVF where people are choosing which if they want a male or female embryo, and then just either discarding the rest or freezing them, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And you would know this better than I do. Are there currently any states that allow you to abort your child for the given reason of sex selection? Obviously, that could be a secondary unstated goal that you have, but do you know of any states that even allow that in abortion?
I don't, but I'll follow up and see if we can get that information to our listeners.
Well, to my knowledge, I don't think there are states that actually allow for sex selective abortion in the United States, at least as the given reason. But that's what then is so striking to me about the IVF industry. So if you are a pro life person, or even if you just like hold to the science, right, of life begins at that moment of fertilization with the embryo, it's a distinct and genetically complete individual that, when placed in the right environment, will continue to grow into a born, living, thriving human person. And so, when we're talking about these things, if we agree that sex selective abortion is bad, that we shouldn't allow someone to abort a baby just because it's not a boy or not a girl, then we should apply that same logic to the fertility industry, saying that it's not acceptable to select which embryos you're going to use just because you really want a boy or just because you want a girl. And interestingly, in the United States, the emphasis has actually been on selecting girls over boys. So in China, the emphasis was on selecting boys. That's caused a host of issues like downstream of that in their culture. But there was a really interesting article that came out in 2024 with Slate that actually detailed the number of women who, due to concerns about toxic masculinity or the lack of support they thought their sons would or wouldn't provide them, have actually relied on IVF, even electively, without a diagnosis of infertility, so that they can guarantee that they have girls. And if you're on social media, and maybe your algorithm will hear this now, there are so many really very disturbing videos that you see of couples who are either like doing rock paper scissors or this random selection where they're like, well, we have a boy and a girl, but we don't know which one we want, so help us choose. Is it box A or box B? And then they choose the embryo that the most people vote on, right? And whether that's the boy or the girl, they go with it. Or they have, in this one really disturbing video, they had like 3 literal presents set out, and then they had their toddler choose the present they wanted, but each present represented a frozen embryo that they had. And then they chose the frozen embryo that the toddler had chosen, which, talking about the impact on future generations, imagine how that child is going to feel when they're older and realize that even without their knowledge or consent, they're 2.5 years old, right? They actually were the ones who chose which of their siblings got to live and which ones either were discarded or frozen indefinitely. And so there's a number of cases where you have couples using this technology for things like outright sex selection. But even beyond that, you were talking a little bit about the embryo grading process. And that's such an important part of this discussion that's rapidly changing with advancements in artificial intelligence. So, as you can imagine, embryos are incredibly small, incredibly difficult to see. There's lots of very high tech tools necessary to even see and try to analyze the health and shape of an embryo. And doing that with the naked human eye is possible, but it's hard. And so, as one person said in a Washington Post article that was published over the summer, that every fertility clinic has their star embryologist, the person who's just the absolute best in choosing the best embryos that are most likely to have the highest success rates. But what if, and this is what the article is diving into, we actually used AI systems to analyze and grade embryos for us so that every single attempt was the quote unquote highest quality attempt possible? And so you're now seeing certain clinics in Mexico, in the United States, and I think this is only going to be rapidly expanding, where they're now not only outsourcing the creation of embryos to laboratories, but now they're outsourcing it even further to machines, where in one case in Mexico, there's an automated AI system that actually goes through the process of IVF from start to finish without any human hands involved. So they're taking the egg, they're taking the sperm, they're placing it together. This AI robotic system is actually the one guiding the process of IVF and which embryos are created. And then on top of that, IVF systems are then grading the embryo and analyzing it to see the sex, the potential health, which ones look like they're the healthiest, the most viable, or not. And so it strikes me as this even further step away from our humanity, where now it's not even a human person involved in what is still a very eugenic process, but now it's a machine involved in this eugenic process of selecting which embryos get a chance at life and which ones don't. So there's a number of things happening in that space. But then thinking about some of the advanced companies, there's something called polygenic testing, or PGTP. And so polygenic testing goes further than even single gene or monogenetic testing. And polygenic testing is looking at the ways that multiple genes in an embryo interact with each other, and then the probabilities that the given embryo will develop certain conditions. So whereas in other forms of PGT, they're looking at the embryo and saying, here's the likelihood that it has this condition. PGTP takes it a step further and says, here's the likelihood that your embryo could develop a certain condition. And so those conditions include things like Alzheimer's or high blood pressure or heart disease or insulin resistance, hearing loss, a host of health factors that are certainly treatable and manageable with modern medicine, but could potentially undermine your quality of life later on. And so it's using this technology, whether it's AI or other technical systems, to then say, well, what's the likelihood that your embryo could have these conditions? And then what are the embryos that are the least likely and therefore the healthiest and the best that you could choose? So in one really surprising, heartbreaking, just horrible example, there was this couple who utilized polygenic testing to select between their embryos. And so they're published in a number of stories, but they said, we saw that one of our embryos had the potential for hearing loss, and we thought we don't want to have a child with hearing loss, so we'll choose the embryo without that outcome. And so they're openly talking about how they chose the healthiest baby. But when you think of hearing loss, those are conditions that are easily treatable with modern medicine, and certainly could be time consuming. Certainly there are complications in the process. But the fact that they are using this technology, not just for these rare extreme genetic conditions, but for everyday conditions that innovations could further address, I think really underscores the sort of eugenic mindset that's just rapidly being caught up in these technologies, where all of a sudden the ability to create a child quickly turns into the desire to create a certain kind of child. And I think that's where you see a really interesting breakdown between those in the pro-family camp, which is where I find myself, you probably find yourself, thinking about how do we actually encourage not only more babies, but family formation so that children can be born into families with married mothers and fathers, and really prioritizing restorative reproductive medicine and root cause care to optimize health. You then have the pronatalist camp, which cares about, which pronatalism really just means more babies, and so wants to see more babies born, oftentimes without a very serious consideration of marriage or any of these other factors. But then you have this third group, and this I call like the pronatalism of Silicon Valley. And pronatalists in Silicon Valley are not necessarily interested in reversing the decline in births or ensuring that as many babies are born, but they're really the ones who are driving this technology that's interested in certain kinds of children being born. And so that's where you see a number of individuals, from Elon Musk to the co-founders of Google, or Sam Altman, or major tech companies, investing heavily in longevity research, embryo selection, to try to optimize life before those embryos have even had a chance to take their first breath. And this approach, this very, I call it consumer eugenics, this whoever can pay enough can then afford to have the quote unquote best child, really overplays the role of genetics in the conversation, say relying on the sort of genetic determinism of whatever your genes say at that embryonic stage is more important than your lifestyle and environmental factors. When in reality, and this is held across the scientific literature, the genetics tests and studies that we do, including in IVF, only determine the potential outcome in about 5 to 10% percent of the time, meaning that about 90% of the actual health factors related to the health of the child have to do with totally different factors related to their environment, lifestyle, and decisions that they make once they're born. So these technologies that are already very eugenic, choosing which embryos are born, which embryos are discarded based on these primary or secondary traits, aren't even that reliable and don't even play that big of a role in determining the overall health of the child. So it's both, I think, very eugenic, but also just a very faulty science that can't even achieve the goals that it sets out for itself.
Wow, that's we're getting into territory that's really scary, and with the eugenic practices around IVF, it's really reminiscent of trying to create a quote unquote master race. And this one isn't based on a specific race, but based on characteristics of disease, trying to avoid certain diseases, etc. And as you said, most of those diseases are also there are factors that are environmental and lifestyle factors that that child will then grow into. And so one, you can't avoid them. But secondly, it's, as you mentioned, the commodification of children, because, you know, when a husband and a wife get pregnant naturally, they're not thinking, well, maybe this child down the road when he or she is in senior age category is going to have hearing loss or is going to have Alzheimer's, etc. They're thinking, I'm going to love this child. And of course, we can talk about some of the genetic testing that couples do, even if they don't conceive with IVF. So there is a that kind of practice going on outside of the IVF industry as well, but it's so rampant in the IVF industry because those embryos are already commodified. You're looking at them as products. Well, which one looks better based on one, our limited knowledge, or two, AI's knowledge, right? As you mentioned, it's not necessarily just humans making those decisions. It's AI making those decisions. I wanted to also mention that one of the reasons why so many embryos are, so many eggs are fertilized and made into embryos is because, as we mentioned, IVF is expensive. So if a couple is going to go through a round of IVF, they're going to want to get the most bang for their buck. And unfortunately, this is the way that um, IVF has commodified children, where people are thinking about it in that way as well. Not that they have to, right? There are some couples who may only want to fertilize one or two, but then they take the risk that they spent all that money and those embryos don't take, they die or they don't implant. So that those are the types of risk calculations that couples are making, and most couples are making the kinds of calculations as to what is the best chance that we will conceive, and so they will try to fertilize as many as possible, and then you have the issue, as you mentioned, of what do you do with the rest of the embryos, and this is not something that the IVF clinics are really walking them through in terms of thinking about beforehand, and then they're left to make these decisions after. So it's a mess, right? um, so you had talked a little bit how there's a lot of deeper issues involved, and most people see IVF as a simple medical procedure. Can you discuss a little bit about the philosophical and moral principles? We already did a bit, but that are missing from the public debate in terms of the public conversation on this. What's missing?
Yeah, no, this is a great question. And so I am not actually Catholic. My husband and I are evangelicals. And so this isn't just, Catholic talking points, which aren't bad at all. But I think it's just interesting to clarify in this discussion because there's usually an assumption that if you're thinking critically about the fertility industry, if you're examining the underlying philosophical implications of these technologies, that you must just be Catholic and you're just, repeating the lines of Pope Paul John II, which are great lines. But so I think it's interesting just to clarify that. So when I've thought about this issue, one of the ways that I've approached it is asking the question of what does the Bible say about how we should think about these technologies? What's the philosophical construction and framework around it. So I've typically approached it from that perspective. And so very similar to what other faith traditions have said, one of the things that I think is very important about this, bringing to this conversation, is the recognition that biblically, philosophically, theologically, there is this package deal of marriage, sex, and procreation in the Bible, where those three categories are this unified whole that are meant to be kept in connection and unity with each other. This doesn't mean that every single every single married person, every single time they have intercourse, must be trying to conceive a child, right? But a recognition that there is a natural continuity between these three things. And so a useful way of framing it is taking the example of a miscarriage. So when a couple suffers a miscarriage, that is an unnatural break in that natural progression of marriage, sex, and procreation, where they suffer the loss of a child very much outside of their control. When you talk about things like IVF or even the destruction of embryos in IVF, you're then shifting the conversation to another break in that natural relationship between marriage, sex, and procreation, but this time more of an intentional decision where it's not just something that happens outside of the couple's control that's very heartbreaking, but it's an intentional decision that they make to turn to IVF, and even in cases to freeze or destroy the human embryos that they've created. And so I think having that framework in mind is that we actually want to, in every way possible, further reinforce that package deal and not undermine it by creating opportunities for sin or even outright sin and loss of life and destruction in our desire to have children. I also like to think of Marshall McLuhan, who is this wonderful Canadian philosopher who lived in the 20th century. And he has a book he has a book and chapters and a number of literature talking about the medium is the message. And so when he's talking about this, what he's saying is that the context, the actual physical creation, says just as much about the message as our intentions do. And he says that you can't simply judge something based on what it does, but about the larger social and psychic impact that it has on a society. So he likes to use the example of a railroad. And he says that when the railroad was created, you could just define it based on the fact that it's, the tracks that are laid out across the United States, the train, the coal, the composite parts of the process. But ultimately, that fails to understand the radical consequences and implications it had in the United States, where all of a sudden you had railways connecting New York to California and Illinois to Georgia, so that the speed and style and approach of travel, of production, of sharing goods across state lines was radically transformed. And all of a sudden, the United States could be far more connected. The mail system could be far more connected and reliable than ever before. And so when he says the medium is the message, he says ultimately it's the impact that the railway had on our society that should shape the way we think about it, not just the literal composite parts. So applying that to something like IVF, when we're thinking about this issue, we can't simply think about IVF as egg and sperm create an embryo, we implant the embryo, we hope we have a child, great. Because that's only looking at what it literally does. But the bigger question is, how does this technology actually shape the way that we think about marriage, about procreation, sex, and about the purpose of the family? And that's where the most dire consequences for our social imagination really lie. And this is where you come to a place where even unintentionally and unbeknownst to, I think, many parents who have undergone IVF, once you start going through the process, all of a sudden our position shifts where in natural conception or restorative reproductive medicine, there's very much this approach to the issue where we are coming in hopes of receiving the gift of a child. So child is blessing, child is gift, something that we receive in many cases outside of our own control, right? You can hope for a gift, but you can't control whether the gift is given and what kind of gift it is. Whereas in IVF, it sort of shifts our mindset where all of a sudden parents and fertility clinics and technicians approach it as child as product or child as project or child as this good that we are now managing or overseeing in a way that's a very different relationship to the child. So Brent Waters, who's of no relation to me but does great writing on this topic, has talked about how the IVF process can shift the way we think about children to more of an assembly line where parents are the overseers of the assembly line, putting together all the composite parts, doing doing the testing, hoping for the right outcome, but that it radically shifts our relationship of parents and child to created and made in a way that really undermines the radical goodness and unconditional love essential for childbearing, parenthood, and the gift of children. And so this is where I think a lot of the concerns for the commodification of the child, for these eugenic practices really come into play, because all of a sudden we're not thinking, to like wrap it up there, right? We're not thinking of child as gift, but we're thinking of child as something that's either owed to us, that we have a right to a child, that we have the right to choose a certain kind of child. And I think that's where we get into so much trouble with these technologies, and a lot of the mindset and philosophical motivations behind these advanced forms of genetic screening and testing and assessments of embryos really come into play.
That is so beautifully said, Emma, and you're right on. The Catholic Church unequivocally and strongly speaks against IVF, not only because it destroys embryos or because you freeze embryos, but what you mentioned, which is the family structure, and that it separates the unitive and the procreative aspects of marriage. And as you mentioned, um, we are not owed children; they are blessings, they are gifts. And so that is what when a couple gets married, they're not guaranteed that, right? Whereas with IVF, it pushes that line. It pushes the line of family makeup, right? As you mentioned, can you imagine gestating your own sibling? It pushes the line of what nature how we're made and how we're made to reproduce, etc. And so there's so many implications of this. And as you mentioned, you come from an evangelical background. My question is, where would you say that evangelicals in general stand on IVF, and what would you want to tell them, the ones who are sitting on the fence and are considering this? And what about people who have no faith at all, or outside of a faith outside of the Judeo-Christian mindset?
Yeah, this is a great question. So we'll take it in two parts. One, where are Protestants today or evangelicals in the United States? And then two, just like big picture, what would I say to this question of IVF and infertility? So on the first, I have done a lot of research into Protestant denominations and where they land with IVF. And actually, at the end of, no, the very beginning of 2024, published this really long essay for American Reformer diving into what all of the top Protestant denominations have said. And so at the time, you have your main lines, the United Methodist Church, the Episcopal Church, certain denominations within the Lutheran Church, which are just very pro any means necessary of having babies. They're pro surrogacy, they're pro IVF. They very much take this right to a child language. They also either are directly or indirectly in favor of abortion, and in short, like don't really value the dignity of human life, and don't have concerns for unborn human life. So taking that and sort of setting it aside, you then have your more biblically based Orthodox denominations. And it's been a really interesting progression over the last couple of years alone. So, in many ways, I think that 2024 was the 1973 of the abortion issue, meaning that when Roe v. Wade was decided by the Supreme Court, you had a number of faithful Catholics who had been and continued to speak out against abortion being this inhumane practice that destroyed human life. But by and large, the evangelical audience and the broader population of the United States didn't really have a firm view or opinion on abortion until you had leaders like Francis Schaeffer and a number of others in the evangelical church that really started championing this issue, such that now when you think of the pro-life issue, you necessarily think of both evangelical and Catholic efforts in this space. And really, in many ways, I don't think we would have the pro-life movement that we have today if it wasn't for the evangelical church coming alongside the Catholic Church and a number of other people to really champion the cause of unborn life. Fast forward to 2024, I think we were and are in a similar position where you have a number of faithful Catholics and other bioethicists and advocates who have been addressing the fertility industry and the harms of IVF and the loss of human life faithfully for many years. But it's not until now that I think you're seeing this groundswell movement among evangelicals really start to take root, such that I think over the next 5 to 10 years, you're going to see a very different approach among evangelicals who I think are going to be much stronger and far more unified on this issue. So in 2024, the Southern Baptist Convention passed a resolution that addressed IVF. It was the first resolution that did. And while it allowed for a limited use of IVF, single embryo creation, no testing, no destruction, a very narrowly tailored form of life-sparing IVF, it by and large decried the loss of human life and the abuses with an IVF and encouraged Southern Baptists across the United States not to use this technology. And it's not binding on churches or Southern Baptists in the same way it might be in the Catholic Church, but it's a huge example of a denomination taking a firm stand for human life, for human embryos in our reproductive technologies. Similarly, the Anglican Church of North America, there are a number of efforts within the Anglican Church to start addressing these issues. One of them that I am in part helping with is through the Anglicans for Life organization and the creation of the Anglican Bioethics Center, which will provide guidance to pastors and to lay people across the denomination. And so here they're tackling all of these issues of IVF surrogacy, embryo donation, and testing and beyond, and really offering very firm, very biblically sound, very pro-life guidance to Christians. And so that's another, I think, very encouraging example of Christians who are ready to apply the pro-life principles they've held for the unborn child to the issue of IVF. And I expect that we will continue to see other denominations do the same. The Lutheran Church, the Lutheran Missouri Synod denomination, has really fantastic guidance also offered in this space, not binding, but really great guidance. And then other denominations like the Presbyterian Church of America, which is very theologically sound, has actually not addressed IVF in any of their official documents. So only one line in one document did they say life begins at conception, and that includes embryos created through IVF. But it doesn't actually address the fullness of the fertility industry, of surrogacy, of what goes on in IVF. And so I think there's a lot of work left to be done in spaces like that to really provide very firm guidance for Christians. But I'm very encouraged in the direction, especially among Gen Z and younger millennials, where I think there's a greater awareness and sensitivity to these things, where they've both seen the impact of these technologies, thinking of children who've been born from it and are coming to terms with assemblies they'll never meet, or they're seeing the harms of surrogacy, with lower income women being exploited for their wombs and realizing how broken that process is. Yeah, so I'm encouraged on that front. But for people who are not even religious, who are just thinking about this, I think the way that I like to approach it is asking the $1 million question. And the $1 million question is what is IVF uniquely capable of doing that other approaches to addressing infertility can't do? Or in short, why would we or should we rely on IVF, and what are the other options available? And that naturally gets us into the question of restorative reproductive medicine, where when I'm thinking about this issue, even if I set aside any sort of religious or philosophical concerns about the treatment of human life and what happens to an embryo, ask the question, what is the best medical care we can provide for couples struggling with infertility? Well, it turns out that, as we've talked about, IVF can be very expensive, have very unreliable success rates, a number of side effects for the mother and the child, such that women who undergo IVF have a host of adverse outcomes, from hemorrhages, necessary C-sections, increased rates of maternal morbidity, and a number of other factors. Children who were created through IVF have significantly higher rates of low birth rate, preterm birth, multiples being conceived, so twins, triplets, quadruplets. They're more likely to have congenital heart defects, cleft palate issues, or other like physical deformities. They're more likely to have autism. There's a number of adverse health outcomes that are associated with IVF, if it's even successful in the first place, if you even have the money to undergo the process. And so instead, what is a better way? Is there a better way to go about it? That's where restorative reproductive medicine comes in. And that's where I'd really make the case that we're actually seeing far more exciting and innovative advances in root cause care. So of the studies that have been done, These root cause treatments for infertility, which heal the man and woman's body and optimize them for successful natural conception, have success rates comparable to or higher than IVF. And that includes the breakdown of different age categories, where it's actually a very competitive option alongside IVF. And whereas IVF may result in the creation of an embryo, IVF can't actually improve miscarriage rates. It doesn't heal the man or woman's body. It doesn't improve their health. Restorative reproductive medicine, because it's treating the whole person, the whole couple involved, you're actually seeing things like better sperm quality, better egg quality, healthier embryos that are being created. The parents themselves are healthy. There was this incredible congressional hearing a couple of weeks ago on restorative reproductive medicine, and one of the mothers there who had undergone IVF, which had failed, and then restorative reproductive medicine, talked about her journey through this process where it did take about 12 to 18 months of restorative reproductive medicine care before she had her first child. But as she was undergoing the process, she was uncovering the fact that she had PCOS, that she had a much higher statistical likelihood of having heart failure later in life, that she had hormonal imbalances that hadn't been addressed, such that by the time she was able to successfully have her first child through restorative reproductive medicine, she not only had a healthy baby, but she was the healthy mother that she desired to be so that she could be around so many more years for her child's life. And it really hit home in her story because as she was going through these treatments, her own father died from heart failure in his 60s. And so she was just reflecting on the fact that she is now far less likely to die at a young age because of the holistic care she pursues so that she can be around longer for her child's life. And what parent doesn't ultimately want that? And so when we're thinking about this, again, it's not a question of it's not a question of if you have infertility, IVF is the best option, but IVF is bad, so therefore you can't have a child. And I think that's what people hear is they hear, well, if you think that there's a problem with IVF, you're ultimately telling me I can never have a child. When in reality, it's so much different than that. And what we're saying is that we actually want to enable you in the best possible way using the best medical innovation and science to have the children that you desire. And IVF is just maybe not the best way to go about that. It's not the best treatment option. It's not best for your own health. And we can still give you comparable or higher than likelihoods of having a child at the end of the road. And I think that's the really compelling case that a number of people, even outside social conservative circles, are really latching on to. And this is where I think the Make America Healthy Again movement has partnered so well with restorative reproductive medicine, because ultimately the goal is better health overall that results in better outcomes, not just relying on these interventions that really bypass the body altogether.
Again, so beautifully said, Emma. And that's the really good news in all of this is that there are healthier options to have babies that improve the mother's health and improve the chances that the baby will be healthy. And it's so ironic because with IVF and especially with the eugenic practices of IVF, the push is to control what diseases the child may have or what eye color or what sex they are. But what's interesting is that when you actually go to the root cause of infertility, that child will probably be healthier anyway because that child avoids all the risks that you mentioned with IVF, and both for the mother and the child, the health risks involved with IVF. And so it's really good news. We're saying there are other options. They're cheaper. They're better for you long term because it actually gets to the root cause of your own disease, of what's causing the infertility, and it's actually better for the child. Could you talk a little bit about, since we're now talking about restorative reproductive medicine, can you give some examples of what conditions a woman or a man might have that causes them to be infertile that could be fixed by restorative reproductive medicine that they can then go ahead and actually conceive naturally?
Yeah. So when a couple receives a diagnosis of infertility, studies have shown that on average, that couple has 4 or more underlying conditions that are resulting in that diagnosis of infertility. And those conditions are typically shared equally between the man and the woman. So a third of the time due to male factor infertility, a third of the time due to female factor, and a third of the time a mix between the two. And so those conditions for women include things like endometriosis, which it's estimated that as many as 1 in 10 women in the United States have, and it's one of the driving causes of infertility. infertility. It includes conditions like PCOS or hormonal imbalances, thyroid irregularities or imbalances, lifestyle factors, having not enough body fat, having too much body fat, depending on the situation. This is where you may have seen some of the really funny headlines where it's like women go on Ozempic, unexpectedly become pregnant, or I've struggled with infertility for years. I went on Ozempic, I got pregnant. And it's like, yeah, it's because your body, your overall health actually plays a big role in your ability to successfully conceive. And sometimes it can be just as direct as changing your lifestyle and getting healthier and losing weight. And that's what your body needed in order to have a child. For men, factors, male factor infertility includes things like low sperm count, low sperm mobility. Across the globe, there have been studies done showing that sperm count is declining, that testosterone is declining significantly among men. This is one of RFK Jr.'s big policies in HHS, is to actually restore men's fertility and health. And while it can still be a very challenging process, one of the really encouraging things we found is that because men are continually creating sperm and continually their cycle is like a 24-hour cycle, right? It restarts every day. Their testosterone levels restart every day, that you can actually reverse male factor infertility pretty directly, where if they're suffering from low sperm count, through lifestyle or hormonal interventions can actually increase their sperm count again. So whereas women are only born with a set number of eggs, men have sort of this infinite ability to keep creating sperm and even creating healthier sperm than they had before. Other conditions like erectile dysfunction can influence male factor infertility, and then also just their lifestyle, their diet, nutrition, substance use of weed or alcohol. All of these factors come into play when we're talking about their fertility or their diagnosis of infertility. But the encouraging thing here is that for each of those conditions, there are personalized and tailored treatments to address those conditions where you can reverse or even heal them, such that endometriosis surgeries enable you to be free of endometriosis. There are treatments to manage your PCOS and remove those barriers to successful conception. Same for male factor infertility, as I got into. And so when we're talking about restorative reproductive medicine, we're using that as an umbrella term that addresses all of these root cause approaches to infertility. And that's why I mean, much of the pushback to restorative reproductive medicine has been largely political, meaning that in most cases, any serious doctor, anyone who's trained in endometriosis, PCOS, or any care regime of that sort recognizes that these are some of the leading causes of infertility, and proper treatments can then restore the health. And so there's a big push with the American Society for Reproductive Medicine and ACOG and a few other fertility organizations to say, well, restorative reproductive medicine is just a political movement. It's fake science. It's not real. They also say, well, we already offer all of these root cause treatments, so you don't need to go to these different doctors. And neither of those things are true, right? Because we know that there are ways that you can treat these conditions directly rather than just bypassing them through IVF. And we also know that the reality is that fertility clinics and doctors are not trained to do that. So they might run very basic diagnostic tests, very basic hormonal panels, but they're not actually diving deep into these conditions and then providing restorative care. So in traditional fertility clinic settings, up to 30% of infertility diagnoses are due to unexplained infertility, which is just the admission that we don't know why you're infertile, but we're going to give you IVF and hope that it works. Whereas restorative reproductive medicine says it is completely unacceptable, given the innovation, the medical science, and the advancements we've seen in our medical care, to ever tell someone we don't know why you're infertile, because ultimately a diagnosis of infertility is just the beginning of the journey to understand your health, your vitality, and address it in a way that you can hopefully naturally conceive children.
Wow. So not only is restorative reproductive medicine cheaper, there's a higher chance of getting pregnant than you have with IVF. So for people who are listening now who are interested in this or are seeking to get pregnant and have had trouble, how do they find these doctors that do restorative reproductive medicine? Where do they turn? What are some of your resources that you can share with our listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a few different medical disciplines who who fall under the umbrella of restorative reproductive medicine. So the first is natural procreative technology, or naprotech, depending on how you like to say it. And so this is connected to the Pope Paul VI Institute in Omaha, and they are one of the first and primary developers of this root cause care for infertility. So if you look up a naprotechnology clinic, any doctor who's been trained in naprotech or is currently a part of it is going to be a premier doctor in addressing infertility or just reproductive health conditions. That's something that I forgot to add, is that with restorative reproductive medicine, it's not just about having a baby, it's about addressing all of the underlying causes, meaning that even if you're a single woman who's just experiencing painful periods, isn't trying to have a baby, but just wants to be healthier, restorative reproductive medicine can apply in that context or in the desire to have a child. So I would recommend going to a naprotechnology doctor, to a FEMM doctor, FEMM, looking at Neofertility, which has a number of clinics within their network, Creighton, which is also part of the naprotech world. And then at that point, also just Googling restorative reproductive medicine doctors. So the International Institute for Restorative Reproductive Medicine has a really great network of doctors across the United States and in 52 countries who practice this kind of root cause care. And then you can also go to Natural Womanhood and look up their provider list, as well as the website Facts About Fertility, which also has a fantastic directory of doctors who are trained in this root cause care, either for infertility in particular or just reproductive health conditions that you would like to be healthier from.
Excellent. And we actually had Dr. Marguerite Duane on the show, and she also discussed ways that people can find the doctors and the care they need for restorative reproductive medicine. And as you mentioned, it's not just for couples trying to get pregnant. It's do you have endometriosis and you want to get pregnant at some point in your life, but right now you're a single woman, and or you have irregular cycles or painful cycles, whatever the case may be, there are some underlying health issues there, and restorative reproductive medicine helps you get to the root cause so that you can be healthier, which is the first and most important part. As you mentioned, you want healthy people, you want healthy parents who will be around, right? Not just a process to slap on to a couple in their process of conceiving, and then the unhealthy habits or a disease is still there. Super encouraging. Everyone should check out those resources. We will link to them in the episode. So speaking on that topic, you mentioned that President Trump, obviously we know he's a staunch supporter of IVF, and he had an executive order back in February 2025 to expand access to IVF. And then most recently in October 2025, he announced the third agreement with a drug company to lower costs and expand access to IVF and other fertility treatments. Given the ethical issues involved with IVF that we already discussed, a lot of pro-life leaders and organizations have pushed back. What do you make of President Trump's move on the IVF issue, and especially with these statements and orders? And is there any silver lining in what the administration has put out?
Yeah, so there's two parts to the IVF report that was released. The first was the agreement with major drug companies through the most favored nation status to reduce the costs of drugs associated with IVF. The second part of the report enabled employers to offer a fertility benefit, just like you would offer a vision benefit or a dental benefit. The beauty of that second part, the fertility benefit package, is that they were completely clear on the fact that this was not going to be a government organized or mandated fertility benefit, but it could truly be a fertility benefit to include any sort of care that that employer wants to include. So they specifically said, if you as an employer want to offer root cause care, restorative reproductive medicine for your employees, then do that. Or if you as an employer want to include fertility services like IVF, you can include that too. Or you can offer a continuum, right, of root cause care and then only IVF in extreme cases if nothing else has has worked. And so when it comes to this IVF report, I think one, it was really decided in true Trump fashion and brilliance, right? He's a businessman, he's a deal maker. He spent most of his time talking about the agreements he had made with major drug companies and businesses to lower costs and increase access. So in many ways, this aligns with a number of the president's initiatives for a number of medical procedures and drugs and their access and availability in the United States. And then the second part, dealing with the fertility benefit, I think there's a lot that conservatives, folks in the MAHA space and beyond, should be very encouraged by, because one, it was not an IVF mandate. It was not an IVF subsidy such that taxpayer dollars are going toward IVF. And it wasn't even a mandate of what kind of coverage you had to provide. It truly was just a framework to enable employers to offer fertility care that they saw fit. So on the first level, there is I think, a very sober recognition that any effort to increase access to IVF will necessarily increase the number of embryos that are created and destroyed. That cannot be overlooked. This will mean that there are more embryos who are destroyed and tested and eugenically subjected to what I would call very inhumane practices. However, there are a number of silver linings and opportunities here that I am genuinely encouraged by. So the first is that the Trump administration in no way buddied up to the fertility industry itself. So in a New York Times story over the summer, Caroline Kitchener reported that according to the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, the Trump admin had outright refused to meet with them. So ASRM, which has a massive political arm, they have a massive office in Washington, D.C., and are constantly visiting staffers and admin officials trying to push IVF and their fertility measures, couldn't even get a meeting with Domestic Policy Council because they had no interest in just furthering the underregulated and unaccountable fertility industry. Second is, during the IVF announcement, President Trump had a chart up looking at how much individuals in the US were being charged for IVF versus individuals in other countries, showing that a drug that would only cost $80 in the United Kingdom could cost $1,300 in the US. And that's just one drug of many before you even get to IVF. And so there was this implicit, maybe explicit criticism of the fertility industry for overcharging Americans and really taking advantage of them in this emotionally vulnerable position, where if you have a couple who wants a child more than anything, it turns out that maybe the fertility industry was actually capitalizing on that vulnerability and making a ton of money in the process, rather than offering the most competitive and effective treatments available. So I think that's a massive encouragement. And then the second thing is that, related to that fertility benefit, it's a huge opportunity for folks in the restorative reproductive medicine and MAHA space to really champion and push for employers to cover root cause care for infertility. As you mentioned, it tends to be cheaper because the treatments for these conditions they're just cheaper and tend to be a more direct care option. The success rates are comparable to, if not higher than, IVF. And beyond that, it really empowers individuals in their fertility journey to receive the kind of personalized precision medicine that they desire and play a proactive role in their health, not just a reactive one when they hope to have a child. And so, based on some polling that JL Partners did earlier this year, when couples are asked about their infertility experience or their desired treatment for infertility, over 70% said that they wanted root cause care before going to IVF. And so this is an incredible way that we can actually provide what Americans naturally desire through this fertility benefit. So I know myself and a number of others will be working on putting together model packages for what does it look like to actually provide root cause care? What should you include? What surgeries or medications or hormonal interventions should be a part of that? What doctors should you be working with? Things in that space. But I'm all that to say, genuinely, I think very encouraged by the direction that we're going in this conversation, because even if many Americans still view this sort of infertility IVF one for one, I think there are countless Americans who are recognizing that the way we treat infertility is far more multifaceted and multifactorial than we've oftentimes been told. And the final, I think, illustration that helps explain this is that when the Alabama IVF decision came out in February of 2024, every single Republican lawmaker and certainly Democrat lawmaker were effectively tripping over themselves to be the very first person to the microphone to say, I'm pro IVF, I'm pro woman, I'm pro life, and sort of like get that out of the way and be like, phew, don't think that I would ever criticize IVF. The Heritage Foundation, a number of others, put in a lot of work really addressing the ethical abuses behind the fertility industry and IVF. But it became very apparent to me and a number of others that ultimately just debating the best way to regulate IVF was never going to get at the deeper problem of how do you actually help couples have the children that they desire. And so that's when we started building out the Restorative Reproductive Medicine platform as a policy initiative, coming alongside what doctors have been doing since the 1970s. And such that when President Trump announced the IVF executive order in February of 2025, there was a very different response. You still had the same people who were saying, this is great, more IVF, more access to IVF. But there were a number of individuals from Riley Gaines to Rachel Campos Duffy at Fox News and so on, who then pushed back and they were like, well, what about root cause care for infertility? What are we doing to actually address these conditions? Such that by the time the IVF report came out, I think it looked drastically different than it otherwise would have because it accounted for this grassroots movement of people interested in more comprehensive fertility care. And I only see that movement continuing to grow during the Trump admin and hopefully beyond in a way that we're having a far more nuanced and holistic conversation about infertility than we otherwise would have.
That's encouraging, even given what's already been published, because obviously, when you're giving women and couples more options, they get to choose. And as you mentioned, most will want to do the restorative reproductive medicine before they even try IVF, and so giving them opportunities for that and information about how they can do that is helpful. Hopefully, they will choose that route versus the IVF route, which, as we mentioned, there's the death toll, there's the health risk to both the mother and the child, etc. And of course, the expansion of IVF means that there will be more embryos created, more embryos discarded, etc., or frozen. In the orders that the Trump administration have put out, does it just affect employers, or in what they've published, is there a way that it can directly affect the average person in terms of insurance coverage, or is it just through their employers mainly?
Yeah, it's just through the employers. So it's not an IVF or insurance mandate, which is what is so encouraging about this. So it really does come down to what the employers want to offer and then the cost agreement that they work out between the insurance company, the employee, and the employer themselves.
Sure,
And,
great.
and that's something that employees can either opt into or opt out of. So it's not influencing their premiums or other factors related to their health insurance coverage.
Right, and then employers who want to provide restorative reproductive medicine as their benefit can do that without coercion of having to provide IVF, et cetera, if it goes against their conscience as a company.
Yes,
Correct?
that's
Yeah.
exactly right.
Perfect. I want to talk a little bit about the IVF industry. We already discussed how the FDA doesn't have the kinds of reporting requirements that it should. But as you mentioned, the IVF industry is underregulated and unaccountable for the most part. What are the biggest policy blind spots right now? And what kinds of policies would you put in place if you had the magic wand to put the policies in place to create an industry that was more respectful to life and even to reporting? And should there be limits on how many embryos can be created or stored? And what other regulations would you put in place?
Yeah, great question. So, if I had a magic wand policy wise, the first thing I would recommend are strong reporting requirements for IVF, so that this would require actually appropriating the correct amount of funds to the CDC so that they can beef up their data collection and reporting mechanism to require clinics to account for every single embryo that's created. How many are created? How many are tested for genetic predispositions or sex or other potential outcomes, how many embryos are frozen, how many embryos are discarded, how many are placed up for embryo adoption. And then as a part of that, I would also love to see long-term studies done on the health outcomes of IVF children and women who undergo IVF. So there are studies that have been done, but I would love to see just annual federal reporting, somehow tracking the long-term health of such persons. That would be the first. A state could pass that as a state reporting requirement for the fertility clinics there. But certainly the federal government through the CDC could also do this. The second thing is that I would love to see the American Society for Reproductive Medicine's guidance legally codified regarding the number of embryos implanted at a given time. So one thing to keep in mind is that when you're having this discussion, if I say, well, the fertility industry is largely underregulated, you then have a number of people looking at you, Cato, and the fertility industry who say, no, it's not. There's a ton of like guidelines and recommended practices that we have to follow. But the key thing to note here is that those are recommended guidelines that the fertility organizations ask clinics to abide by. It's not legally binding. It's not required by law. It's just a recommended guideline. And a recommended guideline is something you could enforce or you could not enforce, and there's not much accountability to know which one you're doing. And so if you actually look at the laws that are in place, it's incredibly limited. So I would love to see a law in place along the lines of what they recommend, actually, of implanting only one embryo at a given time, except maybe in rare cases with older women where they recommend maybe implanting two. And so this is a very narrowly tailored approach. And I think based on where the science, like where practices, clinics have started implanting further embryos naturally because of the rates of twins and triplets and quadruplets that were coming from it. But that would align with the United Kingdom and a number of other countries. The third thing that I would like to see are laws in place governing the number of embryos that are created at a given time, such that we had a narrowly tailored approach where we, instead of trying to create as many embryos as possible to try to maximize success rates, having fertility clinics be far more intentional in the number that they create to better align with the health and desired outcomes of the family. So Germany actually has some of the best laws governing IVF of any country in the world. And they have a law in place where you can only create as many embryos as you can implant at one time. And they have a law that says you can't implant more than 3 embryos. So Germany effectively limits the number of embryos created to the number you intend to implant fresh or at the time of creation. And so I think a similar law in the United States would help address the excess number of embryos that are created and then frozen or discarded year after year. The fourth thing that I would love to see are, well, personally, just an outright ban on pre-implantation genetic testing, any sort of eugenic assessment of the human embryo, saying that based on your sex or your potential health or potential IQ, you either have a right to life or you don't have a right to life. And what's so interesting is that most developed nations actually outright ban PGT. Some countries like Canada and the United Kingdom allow it in very rare instances where there's a hereditary disease confirmed in the parents that they hope to avoid. And it's for rare conditions. But most countries don't allow for this sort of rampant use of genetic testing and selection. A very stark example of it was last year, we were traveling in the United Kingdom, and a waitress was just chatting with us. She had no idea who I was or what I studied. And she was like, "Oh, you're from the United States? You guys are so lucky. I really wanted to choose a girl, but the United Kingdom won't let me choose a girl. And so now I was forced to have 3 boys." She was like, "Thank goodness your IVF laws are so much freer in the United States." And she was on the other end grieving the fact she didn't have access to this. And I was horrified thinking, oh my goodness, like who would ever say that about the sons that they've been blessed with? That you would rather have not had that child so that you could have a girl instead and destroy potentially those other embryos. But it just goes to show you that most developed nations don't allow for this rampant use of genetic testing technology. for a host of reasons. And then beyond that, I would love to see really strong protections in place for parents undergoing IVF. So the Alabama decision brought back to the public discussion the fact that there are a number of failures on the part of the fertility industry that have resulted in the death of frozen embryos, whether that's negligence leaving the fertility freezer unlocked so that a mentally unwell patient from the adjoining hospital could come in and destroy embryos, or cases in Ohio and California where there's been a power outage and a generator failure such that a freezer of embryos was destroyed overnight with like 4,000 embryos being lost. We need really strong protections in place to put the pressure on fertility clinics to ensure that they are protecting the frozen embryos that parents have entrusted to them, and that when through negligence or error on their part, they do act in such a way that frozen embryos are destroyed outside the parents' wishes, that parents have the best ability to hold those clinics accountable, to really empower parents in the fertility process, not the fertility clinics themselves. So those are just a couple of like the top line fertility recommendations. We have a lot more that we've published about that we can talk about too. But then even beyond that, again, ultimately regulating IVF doesn't improve infertility. And so promoting things like the Restore Act, which has been introduced on the federal level or and actually enacted in the state of Arkansas, I think is one of the best ways that states can go to really champion that root cause care and actually improve fertility rates, not simply regulate a fertility industry that may or may not achieve the goals it sets in place.
Hmm. Those really important points that you made, Emma. And if I had a magic wand, I would just ban the entire IVF industry, as I would with the abortion industry, because on the basis of a human rights issue, and obviously, it wouldn't mean that families who struggle with infertility don't have other options. They do. And through the restorative reproductive medicine, they can actually get to the root cause of the issue. It's an issue, right? IVF industry is already a present thing. So as long as it exists, we should at least regulate it, right? And these are the types of limits that we can put on it to protect not only embryos from being created and destroyed, but also to protect the rights of the parents, the families, also with informed consent, etc. So as long as we have this, I would say, even I would call it an evil among us, that's destroying the family, that's destroying family structure and embryos and all of the issues. As long as it's in our society, regulations are very important, because right now it's largely unaccountable to the public and even to the medical community. So those things are all very important. How does the IVF industry's profit model shape the way we think about children and family formation?
Yes, this is a great question. Yeah, and there's probably a number of ways. I'm sure there's a number of ways that you can go with it. I think the thing that stands out to me the most is that by placing such a high cost and burden on parents through the literal cost of IVF, but also the emotional and mental cost of going through IVF, of having to make these incredibly difficult decisions about what to do with the embryos that are created, it further reinforces this commodification of human life, such that it's not just about the child as gift received, but this thing that you have to purchase and negotiate. And yet even choose which embryos you give a chance and which embryos don't get a chance because maybe you don't have the money to continue investing in IVF or continue to support the frozen embryos who are being held at these clinics for hundreds or even $1,000 every year. And I think that's what's even so interesting is that it doesn't really cost the fertility clinics that much money to maintain frozen embryos, right? It's the electricity fee of supporting the freezer. Freezers, which by the way, can hold up to 30,000 or 60,000 embryos in it at one time. And yet they're charging couples hundreds or even $1,000 every year. So they're actually making money on the fact that they're just holding these frozen embryos with few legal protections in place if they fail in that effort to maintain the frozen embryos. And so it's another, I think, example of way that the industry is really profiting off of parents who've been told that this is their best or only route to having a child, and then are now having to deal with the natural commercial tendencies of working with a massive industry that is largely financially motivated when it comes to the business model that's put in place. Many doctors, I have no doubt, genuinely hope to help couples have children. So it's not necessarily speaking to the individual motivations, but the profit structure of the fertility industry that I think really forces parents into lose-lose situations when it comes to the natural desire to have a child and then the financial limitations that they face.
Right. And we mentioned informed consent prior to this. Do you know, for example, what fertility clinics share with families before they go undergo IVF? What is not shared? And what kind of information do you hope that is shared that will become required to be shared with families who are thinking about IVF?
The informed consent requirements come down to the individual clinic protocols and the actual conversations a given doctor is having with the parents involved. To my knowledge, there are no states that actually mandate informed consent that requires clinics to cover various aspects of the fertility industry. Attempts to pass informed consent laws are oftentimes outright opposed by the fertility industry. So, this happened in Arizona a couple of years ago where they simply had a law in place saying couples should have informed consent about the process of IVF and outlined a host of different physical risks, but also just the reality of their success rates. And that was outright opposed by the fertility industry, who, based on some of the groups working on the state level, said that they even had fertility clinics send letters to every single person in their database saying they're trying to take away your IVF, even though it was only a requirement that those families should have informed consent. So there's, I think, a really big push on the part of the fertility industry to have as few rules or regulations that are legally binding on them as possible. And so that means it really is up to the individual doctors or clinics to decide. Some families who shared with me the IVF process were really pleased with the informed consent and had doctors who were very honest with them. Others, I think, have had a much poorer experience. And part of the essential part of this conversation is that when we talk about informed consent, a big part of informed consent is the admission of how much we don't know. And so when we're asking parents to undergo egg extraction or young women to undergo egg donation or the process of IVF, a lot of it is that we don't actually know the long term impact. We don't actually know the potential success rates. We don't know what's going to happen here. And so a big part of it is that clinics are asking for blind faith because we don't have the data and reporting and studies to back it up. And so even just the admission of part of your informed consent is saying that you recognize we don't know everything, I think is a huge part of this discussion that's not adequately accounted for. And things that we want informed consent about are the physical effects at the time of the procedure or the use of the hormonal drugs, the long-term effects of those drugs on both the woman and then the child that's created. Informed consent related to what happens in the process of IVF, the treatment of embryos, the options left to parents, things in that ballpark, I think would really empower parents with a good understanding. And I think as a part of that, even informed consent about other ways that they could treat their infertility before going to IVF, such that you're not just going to the most extreme high intervention treatment first, but are actually building your way up through proper root cause care, and encouraging families to take that to follow care and that continuum rather than just jumping to the very end. I think we go a long way in really empowering families in their infertility journey.
Right. And I think informed consent should be something that individuals and states should really push and regulate these clinics that are involved in IVF because at the very least families should know what they're getting involved in and even informed consent about what happens during the genetic screenings and the tests and what can happen to the embryos and how accurate are they or not accurate because families make decisions based on those things, and if they're not really told much about any of those things, their decisions are not really with full informed consent, and it affects them, right? And so I think that at the very least, this is something that every state should take up in terms of regulating its own IVF clinics, and of course at the federal level, along with all the other policy recommendations that you made. Obviously, with the rise of IVF and a lot of the other technologies, and those other technologies, whether it's not necessarily technologies, but things like surrogacy and egg donations, we're going to take those up in other episodes. But the rise of IVF and all of those different reproductive technologies have changed the cultural meaning of motherhood and fatherhood. And we talked about this a little bit earlier about how the family unit, and especially um, marriage and sexual intimacy leads to procreation, etc. Again, how would you see the cultural shift in how we see family life? Obviously, how we view children with the rise of IVF and other technologies.
Yeah, because these technologies are inherently circumventive, they don't require a man and woman to be engaged in any sort of sexual intimacy to create a child. So, Noor Siddiqui, who is the founder of Orchid, has rather infamously said that sex is for fun, and I think embryo screening is for baby making, something like that. That you can actually separate, that there's actually no longer an essential relationship between marriage, sex, and procreation. And for a long time, people who aren't married, right, can engage in many things, whether they have spouses or not. But with IVF, all of a sudden, you no longer need the sexual act in order to conceive a child. And so this means that a a man could then use his sperm and purchase donor eggs and create an embryo that he then implants in a second woman, the surrogate, who could then gestate and birth the child. And maybe that man is married and the wife is for some reason either unable or unwilling to provide her womb or her eggs. And so you could have one woman who's the egg donor, one woman who's the gestational mother, and then a third woman who is the intended mother who will relationally raise the kid. And so, with the use of these technologies, you no longer need marriage, you no longer need the sexual act to have children, which opens the door to any sort of situation that you can imagine. And one of the things that I think is so telling about this is that a given child born could have up to six quote unquote parents that have some responsibility for the creation. So a child could have the sperm donor, the egg donor, the biological parents, and then the family could use a surrogate. So they have a gestational mother who actually carried and birthed them, who does have a right of motherhood. Gestation makes you a mother in a very real sense. The fourth could be the fertility doctor, who's essential for the creation and implantation of the embryo. And then fifth and sixth could be the intended parents, the mother, the father, or the man and man, woman and woman, who intend to raise the child. So there could be six people responsible as parents in part of the child at the end of the process, depending on what technologies and what approaches a family takes. And so I think that's one of the things that's so important to keep in mind is that because of how IVF works, it necessarily changes the entire relationship of marriage, sex, and procreation, such that those things are secondary or unnecessary in the creation of human life. And you can just sort of outsource the different parts of procreation to different third party individuals as long as you have enough money to pay for the very, very expensive process that would be. And you certainly see that happening with women who, for whatever reason, weren't married, didn't find a viable partner, who talk very openly about having a child through artificial insemination or donor sperm and IVF. Or you have male same sex couples, like men having babies that we talked about earlier, who are using these technologies to have children that they may or may not have any biological relationship to, but have intentionally created for the purpose of raising as their own children, even apart from any biological or natural relationship to the child.
It's really scary, and in addition to all the people you mentioned who could be considered quote unquote parents, now we have the added AI who can also be considered quote unquote a parent, choosing which embryo is quote unquote the best, and that's super scary. This is why, for example, the Catholic Church says that these types of technologies that replace the marriage, sex, and procreation are playing God, right? And one thing that we didn't mention is that children have a right to be conceived in the marital act, the union between a father and a mother. That is actually what's best for children, not in a petri dish in a lab, not among 6 or 7 different participants that are quote unquote parents, because that creates a whole host of issues. And we will get into those issues as well. And then we didn't mention this, but even in the process of fertilization, there are 2 ways to fertilize the egg. One is where they put a number of sperm in a petri dish, and whichever one gets to the egg fertilizes. But there's another one called ICSI where you choose, where the lab technician or AI chooses which sperm is inserted right into the egg, right? So it doesn't leave much up to uh, chance or God. But also in the natural process of fertilization, the best sperm, the strongest sperm that make it to the egg are the ones that fertilize the egg versus with ICSI, right? It ends up that whichever one that the technician or AI chooses is the one that fertilizes the egg. So we have so many issues involved with that.
Well, and this is what's so interesting is with ICSI, clinics have actually stopped practicing it as much because the embryos created actually had higher potential rates of health adverse health outcomes or potential diseases because like you said the healthiest sperm is usually the fastest that naturally conceives it, but if you're just choosing the sperm it may not be the healthiest or best sperm. And so in natural clinic settings they're far less likely to use ICSI now because of the lower success rates related to it. But in the AI IVF, they're only using ICSI as a way of like basically saying that the machine has a better knowledge and understanding of the best sperm than a human eye could. Therefore, this is a better embryo. So it's just a very like insane world where, yeah, just a very insane world to say the least.
Right. And think about AI. AI gets a lot of things right, but we think about something called AI hallucinations, where AI is actually completely wrong on something. And you're entrusting AI to the creation of another human being, putting that much power on AI. And again, we're going to have a whole episode on AI and its implications. But we can see a little bit about how AI affects the IVF industry. I want to now look into the future and also discuss, do you think that there's enough public awareness about the risks and ethical implications of IVF? And what would you do to increase public awareness?
Yeah, I think there is not enough public awareness right now, maybe the understatement of a century. But in the last year, I think there have been really fantastic gains made in our public space within different Christian denominations to start addressing those issues. And especially, again, through Gen Z, through a number of Instagram influencer accounts, TikTok accounts, leaders like Katie Faust with them before us, Ali Beth Stuckey, have really raised the awareness of the younger generation about the abuses and concerns of the fertility industry in a way that I just don't think was the case for millennials or Gen X, and certainly not the case prior to social media. And so maybe that's like one of the silver linings of social media's use in the United States today. So I think there's certainly a lot more that can and should be done, and it goes a couple of ways. One, uh, national messaging is so important. The priorities that a federal or state government sets direct the innovation and medical procedures that researchers, that doctors, that the average person invests in and pursues. So the more that we have HHS and the Domestic Policy Council and the Trump administration really championing root cause care for infertility, the better it will be for couples across the US who are struggling with infertility. And as a consequence of that, I think the more people realize the limitations of IVF when it comes to treating infertility. And then the second, and I think one of the most essential areas, is through the church, making this a priority that pastors are addressing, that small groups are looking into, inviting in speakers who can very lovingly and graciously but very firmly address the ethical concerns and abuses in IVF is going to be so important. Because if you think about it, like when was the last time you heard a sermon that even talked about infertility and provided good guidance to Christians for how they should navigate it? Sort of like this hush hush topic that you don't talk about, where maybe you tell someone in your small group that you're struggling with infertility and undergoing IVF, but very few people would even think to go to their pastor for. And so I think really empowering the church to be leaders in this space, empowering the pro-life movement, the Maha movement. Yeah, so much of our, I think, political and ecclesial discourse will go a long way in elevating this issue. And of course, without a doubt, listening to podcasts like Bioethics Babe, so you learn everything you need to know about these topics and sending it to your friends. Shameless plug that I'm not even, being paid to say.
That's right. Thank you.
Yeah. But promoting this on your social media, sending it to your friends, making it a normal part of the conversation has gone such a long way in elevating this discussion in just the last couple of years. Imagine where we could be in 2 or 3 years if this continues.
Absolutely. And I think we need to have these discussions. This is why I even started Bioethics Babe, because these discussions are very superficial, just in talking points on, 10 seconds on the news, and that's it. And people can't really dive into the implications, right? So I want to ask you about what are the most important questions for policymakers and ethicists to address over the next decade in addressing the IVF industry, the problem of IVF. What do you see that policymakers and ethicists should really tackle in the next decade?
Yeah, this is a great question. And it probably ties into some of the things we've talked about already. So I think the first is looking at the rising rate of infertility, what's causing the rising rate of infertility, what conditions are at play, and then really investing heavily in better treatment options. So, for example, with endometriosis, it's the leading cause of infertility. It's estimated about 1 in 10 women in the United States have endometriosis. And yet, it takes an average of 10 years for a woman to receive a diagnosis, meaning 10 years that she is potentially suffering from very painful monthly cycles, the inability to have a child, and not getting the answers that she needs because we're not actually approaching reproductive health and we're not approaching infertility with that root cause treatment mindset, but one that tends to rely on suppressing symptoms or circumventing the body altogether in IVF. And so I think in like the last couple of years, like the estimate was that for every woman who has endometriosis, only about $2 federal are devoted to research every year, such that we don't actually know what causes endometriosis. We don't know the ultimate origin story of why it occurs. And it's been found not only in the sort of like, below the bikini area, there's even been cases where endometriosis, this extra growth of tissue being found in the eye and other parts of the body. And so, again, this is something that goes far beyond just your reproductive health. It deals with your entire body's health. And that can be said not only of endometriosis, but of all the other conditions that contribute to overall health and fertility. We need way more research and innovation in that space, even just in the kind of treatments offered. So, for many years, a number of endometriosis doctors, for example, relied on this approach to an infertility surgery where they try to burn the tissue away, but the scar tissue from that can then actually prohibit someone from successfully conceiving a child, can further harm their body, and the endometriosis can still grow back in other places. Whereas there's other really incredible doctors who have pioneered better approaches to treating infertility where they're actually cutting and removing it in a way that doesn't further harm the body and can almost guarantee that it won't grow back. So it's just like an incredibly in-depth removal process rather than just like trying to burn and stop its growth. And so even developments in how you're addressing infertility from the surgical perspective are so important in this space. So that would be the top one, looking at male factor infertility. Why is testosterone decreasing? How can we continue reversing those trends? Things that the Make America Healthy Again movement are really prioritizing in very encouraging ways. And then beyond that, I think aside from the question of looking at the real infertility question, I do think we have to come to terms with the science behind pre-implantation genetic testing and whole genome sequencing. And there are NIH grants that are in place with really great research teams who are doing that research right now. And so I think maybe by 2029, they'll have their recommended outcomes from the studies that they're doing. So I'm hopeful to see what terms they come to. But even beyond that, the studies that we have now show that these technologies are just incredibly faulty and unreliable. And so I think a very serious reckoning with the kinds of testing for healthy babies promises that we're marketing to vulnerable families, and recognizing that these studies can't deliver on what they promise. Even if they could deliver, it only has to do with about 5 to 10% of the actual outcome of the child. And even if that were 100% predictive, it would still be consumer eugenics and really bad. And that's what lawmakers need to get serious about to really, I think, restore our relationship with technology and pro family flourishing. But those would be, without a doubt, the top two priorities that I would recommend.
Excellent. Hopefully, policymakers and legislators are taking note of these because you are really in the deep territory with all this and you know exactly, you have your finger on the pulse of this. So, what gives you hope that we can move forward toward a more ethical and human centered model of fertility care in all of this?
Yeah, it's this natural desire that people have to live healthy and whole lives. So much of our modern technology, from digital technologies and social media to reproductive technologies and other emerging biotechnologies, is working to alienate us from our bodies, from relationships with one another, from holistic health. And I think one of the most encouraging things we've seen in the last couple of years alone is this grassroots organic movement to really reclaim health, our spiritual health, our physical health, our emotional health, and say that we are not just machines who use machines or used by machines, right? But we are embodied persons, mind, soul, and spirit, who want to live holistic and integrated lives where we have healthy relationships with one another, where we're happy and not depressed and anxious. And so, in the realm of even reclaiming social media, getting kids off social media apps, getting cell phones out of schools, getting cell phones out of the hands of young people, right? Even empowering older people to have a healthier relationship with their technology. Those movements, I think, are sort of the forerunner of where these other biotech conversations will come in and say, hey, even if we feel compelled, even if there's this addictive quality to it, at the end of the day, we recognize it's not actually making us healthy. It's not delivering the promises that we were sold. And we want more from our technology. And I think that drive to really channel our technology towards human flourishing, towards these pro family outcomes, is both one of the more encouraging things I'm seeing, and I think the future of where we want to see technology go. Because it's not a matter of being anti technology, right? I'm actually very pro tech and very pro technological innovation. I just am very bullish on how we develop our technology. And I don't want to accept anything less than technology that's oriented toward the flourishing of the family. And tech that does anything less than that, that hinders the family or even rejects the goodness of the family, is technology that we simply shouldn't be pursuing and shouldn't be creating. And as humans, and with this incredible agency that we have to steward the world, that is our creation mandate. That is our calling today, to fight for technological innovation that aligns with those values and accept nothing less.
Beautifully said. And I would only add to that that it's also technology that protects human dignity, right? Life of every single person and protects human rights. So that's the kind of technology that we're for. And it's a call to go forward and be creative in creating those technologies that actually protect the family, protect the human person. If you were to speak directly to a couple who has been struggling with infertility and is considering IVF, what would you want them to know before making the decision?
Great question. So the first that I would say is that, one, there is not enough compassion in the world to meet couples who are struggling with infertility. It is such a good thing to desire a child and to desire to offer your body in this radical act of hospitality to bring forth life, even with the potential risks and complications that can come from it, and really affirm them in that desire to have a child, that there are few greater things that one could pursue or prioritize. And that second, as a part of that, that there are incredible medical opportunities for them to address the root causes of their infertility, that their infertility is not this thing acting upon them that's outside of their control or outside the ability of a medical provider to explore. And maybe they don't have the answers at the end of the day, but my guess is that when pursuing the right treatment, they can have far more answers than they would otherwise have. So, what I would recommend is going back to the earlier recommendations, take the time to find a NAPRO-tech or a FEM or neofertility RRM doctor, but someone who's actually certified in those approaches, to meet with them and start understanding what is causing your infertility. Because if you're struggling with a diagnosis of infertility, that is a signal that there are other things that are not functioning as they ought to in your body. And so the first question is understanding your health. So charting your cycles. Through a very detailed charting process that Creighton and a number of others can teach you, understanding what's going on, and then meeting with doctors who are skilled and actually working with you in that process. There are some Christian couples in particular who have come to me and said, well, we are struggling with infertility, but we went to this like nutritionist or this integrative doctor, but they couldn't really give us any answers. And while I have absolutely nothing against doctors who practice in that realm, I think it is so important to recognize that those individuals are not necessarily trained to address your infertility. So I think it's just so important to make sure that you're working with a certified professional for that. But being the number one champion of your health, and really pursuing everything that you can with those doctors, with your overall health and lifestyle, recognizing that there's a lot of autonomy and opportunity that you have to address your infertility head on, and not feeling like you just have to turn to IVF as the only option available. And even maybe on this other end of that, as there are other couples I've spoken with who said, well, we're struggling with infertility. We want to have a child, but we think it's wrong to intervene in any way. If we're going to have a child, we'll have a child. And if not, we'll just keep living our life. And I think on that side of the things, that's maybe an overcorrection in the opposite direction, where the Bible, where just, Christian history, what have you, is very clear that the Lord empowers people with wisdom and discernment. That wisdom begins with the fear of the Lord, which limits the opportunities available to you as a Christian, but it empowers you to use the tools available to pursue the good things the Lord has blessed you with or said are good for humans. And children are one of those top priorities. And so I would also want that couple to then feel empowered that it is a good thing to pursue treatments for infertility, insofar as those are treatments that actually affirm the goodness of the body and of human life, and not being afraid that even that's overstepping. Because I think we are empowered with these incredible medical innovations to make the most of them, to have healthy lives, pursue the children that the Lord may bless us with.
Thank you so much, Emma. Beautifully said. And hopefully, this episode helps couples who are struggling with infertility, or even people who have heard about IVF but don't really know enough about it. And you have laid it out so beautifully. And thank you so much for joining Bioethics Babe.
Of course. Thanks so much for having me on.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Bioethics Babe podcast. If you've enjoyed this content, please subscribe to my YouTube channel and your favorite podcast platform, and share with your friends and family. Also check out bioethicsbabe.com for the latest episodes and resources.